say that they want to get more private investment into their places to help them grow and prosper. And many of them, maybe not all of them, many of them often complain that they often get overlooked, particularly if they're in certain parts of the country. So we thought it'd be ideal to have two colleagues with us today, two panelists that can really shed some light on this investment agenda, particularly because they've got a sort of sense as to how place and investment come together, to really talk to us about what they're doing, but also what they're looking for in places if they're looking to make investments and to improve the prosperity of those sorts of places. So we've got Lorna Pimlott, who's Managing Director of Local Authority Advisory and Lending at the National Wealth Fund. And we've got Duncan Johnson, who's the Chief Executive of Northern Gritstone. So those are panelists. We're going to do this in sort of two parts, really. First part, Lorna, then Duncan, we'll take a few moments just to set out what their organisations are, what their remit is, broadly what they're doing. And then we'll get into some of the issues that they're experiencing as they think about how to make investments in different parts of the country, into firms and into projects, and we'll explore that. And as always, you can put questions, comments, queries in the Q&A function. I'll keep an eye on them and feed them into the conversation as we're going along. So that's how we're going to do it. So Lorna, you kick us off. As I say, National Wealth Fund. Tell us a little bit about what the fund is all about, what it's currently doing, and then we'll hear from Duncan.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And I'm presuming you can all hear me okay. Yeah, great. Yes. Always good to know. So yeah, lovely to be with you this afternoon. So I'm really hoping that most of you have heard of the National Wealth Fund, but I think it's probably a good place to start because that's not always the case when I'm at events. So the National Wealth Fund has only been established for 5 months, so we are fairly new. Being launched by the Chancellor in October last year at the Investment Summit. And for once, government decided not to form a brand new organisation for the fund, but actually transition what was the UK Infrastructure Bank into the National Wealth Fund, which meant we were able to hit the ground running as of October, already an organisation of circa 300 people. So I'll just take you on a little bit of a journey through that transition. So the UK Infrastructure Bank had been established for more than 3 years by the announcement in September. With the we have our shareholder is Treasury, our only shareholder, who purpose really in setting up our organisation was to partner with local government and the private sector in pursuit of 2 key objectives. Firstly, transitioning to net zero, and secondly, supporting and driving regional and local economic growth. Now, to do that, Treasury mandated that we would invest in 5 sectors, which were water and waste, digital, transport, and clean energy. And they gave us a notional 22 billion to invest at that point. When we therefore transitioned to the National Wealth Fund, we were quite clearly not going to have infrastructure in our title anymore. And that is completely deliberate. So for the first time, our organisation can invest in additional sectors to infrastructure. We will still be investing in infrastructure, just so you're clear, but we can do additional sectors. And I'll come on to that in a minute. So 3 main changes for the National Wealth Fund moving from the Infrastructure Bank. Firstly, broader sectors. So government promoted in advance of the announcement that they wanted more investment in areas such as gigafactories, carbon capture, green hydrogen, green steel, and ports. Now, most of you will probably realise that most of those are still infrastructure. So in fact, from an investment perspective, we were supporting those sectors anyway. But the big difference is the industrial strategy. And as we await the full publication in the summer of the detail of that strategy, we have been working with Treasury to understand where they would like us to deploy our additional capital, into what growth industries within that strategy. And in fact, we only received our strategic steer from government just over a week ago, which for the first time has highlighted that we will indeed continue to prioritise transport. We will continue to prioritise clean energy, but we will also have, for example, advanced manufacturing as an additional sector. We will also be able to support other industries within the strategy, such as dual purpose defence technologies. As we've had our steer a week, you'll appreciate we are, as an organisation, working through what that will mean, because we are aware we need to articulate quite clearly to the market quite quickly. But defence is not a sector that we have been in before. So we are now recruiting specialists to help us do that. And other sectors such as life sciences, again, a very big sector, but we will articulate over the next 2 or 3 months specifically what areas we will invest. But we've got an additional 5.8 billion to invest, which is great. So we've now got 27.8 billion. That said, today we've already deployed just under 5 billion of our original 22 capital. So we've done 45 deals in the private sector and the public sector. We have, with that, brought in over 12.5 billion of private sector capital, and we've allowed for the creation of over 15,000 jobs. And I think key to today, I would really like to make sure you really understand, is that our organisation is about solving problems where there are finance barriers in the market to investment, where perhaps commercial banks might not come in so early. We as an organisation take 4 times the level of risk than commercial banks, and we take twice the level of risk to, for example, EIB, the European Investment Bank. And that is deliberate. That is to seed funds and reassure the private sector, often in nascent technologies, for example, where there really is the lack of certainty with regards to which technology will be the one that actually becomes mainstream. But we recognise that from a net zero perspective in particular, we have to broaden our investment across the new technologies to make sure we're in with a shout, that we'll have some of those technologies that are supported. So our journey is, we're on our journey. We've got a lot more to do, and I think there's a lot more I can share, but I'm going to stop there, Andrew, and pass back.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lorna, and we'll get into how you are then taking that forward and how you're already doing work with different places across the country. But Duncan, let's turn to you. Similar sort of remit. Just give us a sense as to the origins of Northern Gritstone, where it came from, and where it currently is, and the types of firms and types of investments that you're making.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Andrew. Hello, everybody. Northern Gritstone is an investment company. It was founded in 2021, and we invest in venture capital into Northern England-based science and innovation companies. We have a 15-year agreement with 3 of the leading universities in the north of England, which is Leeds, Manchester, and Sheffield, effectively providing the capital and support. And the support is probably just as important as the capital to entities looking to spin out from those universities. We also invest in other science innovation-based businesses in the north of England, but the majority of what we do comes from the core university partnerships. I mean, the business was formed through necessity in part, and it really plays into part of your introduction, Andrew, that when I got approached to set up Northern Gritstone, it wasn't too difficult to find some research that really showed a massive innovation blind spot within the UK. And the figures I had at that time were from 2019, and there was 1.2 billion invested in the UK in early stage science innovation in 2019, of which only 28 million came to the whole of the north of England. So 980 million went to what's called the Golden Triangle, Oxford, Cambridge, and London. Yet, the amount of research going on in the north of England is pretty well the same as that going on in the Golden Triangle. So you have a level playing field of research going on in the UK, and this enormous imbalance of where private capital was looking to invest. And that on the back of that, and on the back of the agreement with the universities, we've been able to raise what is a considerable amount of money, just shy of 370 million of permanent capital, to invest in very early stage science innovation businesses based in the north of England. And as part of that, we are growing out an ecosystem and all the support that sits around that, because it is much more than just the capital. And I'm sure a lot of the things we're going to talk about today will emphasize that things are more than just money. Money obviously important, but it's more than everything. So we've made 32 investments. We across the portfolio employ about 1,000 people. We've created, we believe, about 350 to 400 new jobs through our investment, and it's incredibly exciting. We are creating the world-class businesses of tomorrow that are founded on the world-class science that we have in the UK today. And I am absolutely convinced that the first $1 trillion business in the UK will come out from the sector in which we invest, or come from either what we're doing or from what's happening in Oxford and Cambridge, London, or in the Southwest. But this is where the future of the UK economy, I'm absolutely convinced, will lie over the next 20 to 30 years. We have some amazing research and development going on that deserves to become a world-leading businesses.
Okay. And we'll get into how you're working with different organizations. Lorna sort of finished, Duncan, by saying, well, actually said throughout, but just reminding us that in part there is a sort of industrial strategy overlay to what the Wealth Fund is trying to do, and both in terms of the projects but also the places in the country. I mean, to what extent is Northern Gritstone plugged into, or does it have regard to industrial strategy or government priorities more generally? Is there a play for you in that sort of space, Duncan, or not really?
So Northern Gritstone's a company that's owned by a very broad range of investors, from UK institutions and pension funds to local authority pension funds to British Patient Capital, which I expect is now part of the National Wealth Fund through that merger. And also the three mayors in Leeds, Manchester and Sheffield all have investments through their authority, through the funds they manage. I sort of think Northern Gritstone is actually a manifestation of our industrial strategy. That is part of the wins in our sales. We're not constrained in terms of the type of science we invest in. So we are investing across the range from what's known as deep tech, which could be AI, be new materials, that kind of area, through to health tech, which is typically new medical devices or techniques used in medicines, and actually then into actual life sciences and biotechnology and creating new treatments or therapies and that type of thing. So we have a very broad mandate. And I think the exciting thing for us with government, we obviously have regular dialogue with government, is we're sort of pushing things forward on a very broad front that comes within science and innovation.
Right.
And it's using that thing that we are manifestly number one globally in, which is our university sector, and in the R&D going on there. On a per capita basis, we are by some way number one globally in that sector. Yeah. So if you look at the true competitive advantages the UK have, this is one of them.
Yeah. So one of the questions you've already in from Colin, it was aimed at you, Lorna, but which was about, do you have a spatial dimension? Is there any sense it will prioritize investments outside of the greater southeast? So I'll come to you on that in a second, Lorna. But Duncan, presumably the northern bit of Northern Gritstone suggests the bit of the bit of the country that you're more interested in, or completely interested in, or solely interested in.
Yes, well, you can see a chunk of it behind me. That, for those who go climbing, will recognise that as Northern Gritstone. So yeah, we are firmly place-based.
Right.
But it doesn't mean we are just local. In fact, everything starts local, but the ambition is very much that becomes regional, national, internationally important. Yeah. But to receive funding from Northern Gritstone, you have to be starting your journey in the north of England, and it's not in Scotland, I'm afraid. It's not in Wales. It's in the north of England, and the geography, for simplicity purposes, maps directly across to the Northern Powerhouse definition of the north.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Lorna, do you want to just come in on that? Because it's what's the I suppose, spatial element, but also a deliberately non-Greater Southeast emphasis within that spatial element.
Yeah. So we're not called the National Wealth Fund for no reason, shall we say. We have 4 nations within which we operate. So we do operate across Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales as well as England. And I think that's really important. And we've already got established offices in each nation and have done deals in each nation already as well, whether that's private sector or public sector, which I lead. So I think we are very mindful of the balance and the spread of the capital that we deploy. Certainly leading the public sector side of the organization, we have 4 billion to deploy directly to local authorities. Now, to date, we have only deployed about 750 million of that, largely because a lot of the projects actually aren't there yet. And I'm sure we'll get into a bit more of that later on, as you hinted on earlier. But I think we are very mindful that we could probably deploy all of it to London tomorrow if that was the way, if we just wanted to deploy that capital. TfL and GLA would probably eat it up entirely all on their own. Now, we've done deals with GLA and TfL. In fact, TfL is the Dockland Light Railway new rolling stock is the picture that I've got behind me. And we did that deal at the end of December 23. So we do deals with the Southeast and London, but absolutely we are very keen to ensure that that is balanced. So, for example, the last financial year, I say that as today is the first day of our new financial year, we did 2 flood defence schemes in Wales, for example. First deals we've done in Wales, and first deals we've done in flood prevention actually as well. So from a sector perspective, we're also very mindful that we need to spread the segmentation across. From our perspective in local government, the focus tends to be around building decarbonisation. So that might be retrofit, that might be heat networks, mixed infrastructure. So really helping local authorities get their development sites away. And that is a new, I would say, big focus that we're seeing from local authorities, where they're struggling to get developers to come in early and do those early works and site works. And the minute that we lean in and help them do that, they can get their sites away. And that isn't dependent on where they are located across the UK. We will review at each investment committee relative to the project and what it is offering and the likely success of that project and its impact. So, we are very careful to balance, and our board is also very strict with us to make sure that we don't just focus all our attention in certain regions of the country, shall we say.
Yeah, brilliant. Excellent. Duncan, you talked a little bit about, when you were introducing Gritstone, about, you've got a wide range of different types of investors that are, have bigger or smaller stakes in the fund itself and in the organization. And you also talked about, trying to create an ecosystem, a network almost that is a supportive network, not just an investment or funding network. Just say a little bit more about, I guess, the existing relationships, the existing activities that you're already undertaking with some, with places across the north, and then we'll get into what some of the barriers that you've observed in trying to do that. But just paint a picture as to the nature of the partner and the nature of the partnerships or the arrangements that you've already got. And I get Lorna to say something similar, from a wealth fund perspective. You're on mute. No, you're not.
Forever the mute button. What we do is what I describe as a contact sport. It involves meeting people and there being a density of people to meet and all that sort of good stuff. But it is very much old-fashioned networking, meeting, workshops, all that sort of good stuff. So that is absolutely place-based. You can't do that on Zoom and these other things.
Yeah.
So we have offices in Leeds, Manchester, and Sheffield. I'm in the Sheffield office today, and we also have an office in London. So we, for a relatively small business, we have a lot of offices, and that's important because you need to be in the heart of what you're doing, and that's really what is so important around the ecosystem. So if we look within places, we look at and say, okay, we can go and learn how to do this better from them. So Cambridge is obviously a very exciting ecosystem within the UK. It's probably the most developed ecosystem here, where you've got science parks, you have innovation centres, you have a sort of clustering of funding, and also a clustering of talent and entrepreneurs that have exited businesses and that sort of thing. And then the really sort of what good really looks like, you go and see in Boston around Kendall Square and Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is really quite inspirational when you go and visit there. And it is those ecosystems we are trying to get to. Right. So that's about having a density of talent, a density of capital, a density of service providers, availability of the right type of space. So across the three cities where we spend most of our time, Leeds, Manchester, and Sheffield, you've got quite a gradation there. Whereas I would say Manchester's been on this journey, and Andrew, I expect you would know the dates, but for about 20 to 25 years, starting under Howard Bernstein, and really the devolved mayoralty of Andy Burnham has really compounded it up. Really impressive where Manchester has got to over that period. People like Brunt would have been really important with L&G and creating innovation space. Then you've got probably next on this is Leeds, slightly behind. But actually, when you look at what's going on within West Yorkshire, and particularly within Leeds, a lot of new space coming on, which is infrastructure based, which helps suck in and retain talent. And then probably the one most behind is Sheffield, where Sheffield city centre quite hollowed out. The university sits a bit on its own within that as a beacon, but really not enough space, and quite hard for businesses when they are created and start scaling to find space to stay here. So it's quite interesting. We see definitely a gradation there. So we have close relationships with the three mayors, and who quite I'm a real fan of devolution, and it's their connectivity with people like us, I think, helps create a more thriving environment and understanding how private capital and local government can actually combine together to be really very effective.
Brilliant. Lorna, come in on a similar question, or just explore in a sense when you're thinking about doing the deals or thinking about where those projects might be. How are you working with? Who are the partners? What are the partnerships that you're already beginning to forge?
Yeah. So, couple of main points on that. So, from a local authority perspective, we are working with authorities literally right across the UK. Now, there's obviously over 400 local authorities. We're not working with all 400, but our advisory service alone worked with 50 in the last financial year on different engagements, helping them with advice and support to get their projects up and away, basically, and accelerate the pace that they're able to bring those projects to market, which I think is really key. There was an announcement in January, which some of you may or may not have picked up from Treasury, which said that we would, as the National Wealth Fund, we would launch 4 strategic pilots with Greater Manchester, West Yorkshire, West Midlands, and Glasgow City region. Now, very much these are the first 4 to go, but we are working with all the MCAs in England, but I would note they are only in England, and combined authorities across each of the nations as well. So the plan is very much to learn the lessons with the 4 that I've flagged, to make sure that all the others benefit from those, but those are likely to be slightly further advanced with regards to their investment pipelines, which you've touched on earlier. And, I agree with you that saying that you're working on an investment pipeline and knowing what an investment pipeline is quite a different thing. And I hear every government department mentioning that they are going to be supporting on investment pipelines. And I do think it depends who you're speaking to, what they actually think you're talking about. So we as an organization are leaning in on that. But I think one of the things, particular for attendees on this call to be aware of, is the National Wealth Fund is not a fund as Duncan and his organization deal with funds. We operate as a bank. We are titled the National Wealth Fund, but we operate as a bank, just as we did when we were the UK Infrastructure Bank. And I think that's really important, because I was speaking at a local government pensions fund conference last week. And the minute I got down from the stage, somebody said, "Can you tell me what size your fund is?" And I thought, okay, perhaps I didn't quite get that across. So I'm gonna
feedback though. It's good feedback. It's always helpful to clarify the message.
Absolutely. But we can help from our private side with debt and equity and guarantees, and we can help with our public sector side currently with direct lending to local authorities. And it will be a mix of all of that we will work with the 4 strategic pilots on their pipeline to see where we can best help them. Back to my earlier point, we will only invest where we are absolutely needed. If the funding and finance can be found elsewhere, we will not invest. That, if there's no issue in the market and there's no challenge that we're trying to solve from a finance perspective, we are not needed.
Right.
That is great. That is a win from us, from our perspective. And we will be able to invest in sectors where there are some real barriers and challenges. So I think, if I reflect on we had an investment committee this morning, the first question is always, can they get the money anywhere else? If the answer is yes, it is the shortest investment committee.
Yeah.
Because then we're not needed. And I think that crowding in piece is also really important. So often we have to go in first, again, back to the point that we are prepared to lean in and take a bit more risk than perhaps a commercial bank or other organizations might. But we always must ensure we bring private sector behind us. If they're not with us, they're behind us, so that we are seen to crowd in. We are not intending to compete with any other organizations in the market, because, as I say, if we're not needed, we simply won't play.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Let's turn a little bit to, I suppose, to some of the barriers that when you're looking across your various patches. Why is it that we're what's preventing you from investing more or doing more deals, Duncan? I mean, on the one hand, is it like you don't have enough, you don't have enough funds under management? If you had more capital, you could deploy more of it. Or is it simply that you're not seeing enough deals, particularly investable deals? Or, in the sense of doing more from your perspective, where are the constraints or the bottlenecks as they currently exist, Duncan?
Okay, great question that, Andrew. And I think you know what I'm going to say here. So we have a surplus of amazing science. There are just under 14,000 researchers in the 3 universities we have the long-term relationships with. There's about 700 million of R&D a year. 92% of it's rated world class. No shortage of amazing science. What you have is the bit that needs to sit around that to create a business. So first of all, the science needs to be able to turn into a solution that has a real world demand of sufficient scale. But then you need to have the people and the team that can do that. And that is the bit that is the hen's teeth of our equation. The science is there. I've got enough capital. Northern Gritstone has enough capital. And if the quality of the opportunity is good enough, you will get capital. Capital crowds into great opportunities. We are an investor of first resort, not in the position that Lorna is in with the National Wealth Fund. We are looking for the very best and to really give it the best chance of being successful. So we spend a lot of time and effort preparing investments. So normally 2 years before they they sort of hit the start line of putting together teams, working with the universities in particular on proof of concept, proof of marketing, proof of market, really stress testing everything, getting what I call match fit to start the race. If there was suddenly a tsunami of capital came into this sector, it would actually probably go backwards, because there isn't sufficient quality of product, because you don't have sufficient of all those ingredients to make the perfect cake in the market at the moment. And the worst thing that could happen is you get a lot of things getting back that didn't deserve to get backed, and therefore the returns from the sector don't hit the expectations that have been set with investors, and then you don't get the capital coming in. So I think one of the things we need to think about is creating sufficient density and concentration. I think we have a really attractive pot of jam here, but it's only one pot of jam, and you can't spread it everywhere. And you've got to work out where you want to play with it. Now, I do think the trickle effects really come off that at quite a pace.
Yeah.
But I think you have to start it off by concentrating, and to get great outcomes. And from that outcomes, I think it compounds really quite rapidly. But if you look at MIT, it took them 50 years to get to where they are now.
Yeah.
I don't think it needs to take us 50 years, but it probably is decades rather than years. You have to be patient in this game. So I think we can accelerate it. I think we can do lots of sensible things to get there quicker than we might, but you still need to be patient.
That's really interesting. I'll come to Lorna in a second, but Duncan, just maybe I've heard you speak in other sort of spaces on this, because the often, I mean, not everyone, but often you hear politicians say the reason why we don't see the investments happen in the north, for example, outside of the Greater Southeast, is because there's not capital available to those firms that knows those firms, etc. But if I'm hearing you right, that actually what you're mainly saying is that there's a quality product question, and we need to support and enhance and develop more quality in the product that can then consume some of the capital, or the capital that is already available through Northern Gritstone, etc. Is that right?
Yes, I'm generally a believer, and I know this isn't a view shared by everybody, but I've been 30 years investing in private businesses in the UK. So I've done the yards when I was a younger man of going out and finding opportunities. And capital is good at finding good homes. That's one of the most amazing things about the sort of, the investment world. So if you're not getting the money, you have to look at why you're not getting it. And just saying everybody else has got it wrong and I've got it right is probably not the right answer normally. Normally there's a bit of six of one and a half a dozen the other, but sometimes a bit more so. Yeah. One of the things about the product in the north is because capital has gone elsewhere for quite a long period of time, you don't have all the ingredients here to the extent you'd like to have them. You need time for that to happen. Now, one of the Northern Gritstone employees at the moment, just north of 30 people, from a standing start 3 years ago. 20% of the people who work for Northern Gritstone now have moved into what we call the Northern Triangle from London, or somebody's actually moved south from further north to work here. But I think it's it's a really good manifestation of that polarity being reversed. Now it's a slow start, but it's vital that rather than people feeling you have to keep going to London for great jobs and great things, you can find them locally, or in fact you can make a decision that I'm going to go and move into this area because the opportunity set it's providing for me is so exciting. And that's the sort of thing that I'm getting quite excited about, that we're starting to see the reversal of those sort of things, and the ecosystem that we are actively promoting.
Brilliant. One more question to you, Duncan, and I'll bring Lorna in. You talked about creating an ecosystem, where capital, talent, space, networks, are all part of the ecosystem. is the first mover there the capital, in a sense that Gritstone has the influence it has, because literally at the end of the day, it has money to invest. I mean, I know it's hard to disaggregate and say, this one is more important than that one, but I mean, if you were starting from now, is the sort of capital element the really quite important pivotal bit?
There's a definite chicken and egg here.
Yeah.
And at one level, capital is the easiest thing to solve for, because it is so fluid and there's people working on different risk returns. But if I look at what Bruntwood and LNG have done mainly in Manchester, but also further across the north, is quite amazing in terms of the ambition shown there by those two organisations, because they have the duration of capital that allows them to do that. I think you've then got let's be very clear, Northern Gritstone only raised its capital because we could convince high quality investors that we could give the return levels they require for the risk they're taking on. So that involved really setting out what the opportunity was. And part of that was the fact that it was underinvested. So you were starting at a lower level that gave you more return potential. That was quite important in that. So capital, I think, is always a good place to start, but unless the other things happen relatively quickly, the capital itself doesn't get you there. And I think we've seen that through quite a lot of the small regional funds that have played in the venture space, where the returns have been very poor and actually has sort of put people off investing in the space. When we first went to the Northern Local Authority pension funds, we were told in pretty short order where to go, because of the very poor history they'd had in small venture capital. Fortunately, they gave us another go to really explain why we thought it was a good thing to do.
It would be different this time.
And we got there, and they're now our biggest backer.
Brilliant.
So that was a proper reversal. But there's many ingredients. Capital is obviously very helpful in that, and at one level is probably the easiest thing to unlock, because but it's got to resonate. You are competing against private equity, private debt, infrastructure, all these things. And the worst thing you can be in venture capital is the funder of last resort. Because the stuff doesn't deserve the money.
Quite. You're left with the stuff that no one else wants. Lorna, come in. So similar question to you. In terms of some of the barriers and obstacles. Are you? Could you deploy your funds 10 times over? So you don't have enough money to invest. Is it investable project? Because you said something interesting earlier on. You said we could invest all of our money or spend all of our money in London, which seemed to suggest that the institutions of London, TfL and GLA, could provide you with a suite of investment opportunities that maybe are not so readily available elsewhere. Just unpack that for us.
So I think that's not saying anything new, right? I think most people recognise that as a transport authority, TfL is very well established and GLA is as well. But I think a couple of things, actually picking on what Duncan said. I mean, we're very, very acutely aware of this outside of London piece and, the levelling up. So our headquarters of our organisation is in Leeds. That is completely deliberate, completely deliberate. We have an office in London, but be assured that the bulk of our staff all rock up on a daily basis to Leeds, not London. We have a very small office in London. And I think the other thing, talking about sort of private side and deal flow, our private side, we probably have the largest origination team of bankers outside of London.
Right.
And that also is really key to what we're trying to do, particularly in the private side when we've got, we had 8 billion of private side capital and we had 10 billion of guarantees as well. So 18 of that 22 was all going to be led by the private sector. We have now an additional 5.8, as I've already touched on. But I think going back to your question around where we see the challenges. So the reason that we have an advisory service is because we see literally day in and day out that many local authorities, for example, they don't have the capacity and capability. We know that is not a new problem. But actually, where they're needing specific, we would say impartial and independent advice, is around the commercial viability of the projects.
Right.
And the options that they've considered as to how to fund and finance their projects. That might include the structuring of their projects. It'll certainly include how they're putting the different cases of their business cases together. And this is key to actually the private sector wanting to be at the table. How attractive are their projects to the private sector? So it's one thing for a local government to say, oh, you know, we might struggle to get the private sector to the table, but actually they got the best deal and the most attractive deal. So we spend quite a lot of time, for example, around risk and the balance of risk, and Duncan touched on this briefly a moment ago, making sure that, for example, if a local authority has got a project that they're developing, that they actually want a seat at the table. So if we take heat networks is a good example. So it's complex, it's new technology, it's generally not a technology that local authorities have a bank of experience in. So they're either going to pay for advisors to help them with that, or they're going to struggle, basically. Yeah. Now, what we try and help them understand is that there are different ways to go about that, and that actually it's not all or nothing. So it's not, okay, we don't know enough about this, give it all entirely out to the private sector. Because if they do that, they are not going to be able to share the upside come the day that there is some. And that doesn't tend to go down well in local government because they feel a bit burned in the past. PFI is an example where they felt that they really didn't share much of the upside. The private sector took all of that. So we're increasingly having conversations with local authorities to say, be very clear on the role that you want to play. So if you want a seat at the table, great. Then there's a likelihood is you'll be able to share the upside when it comes on. If you don't want a seat at the table, then the private sector will want a higher level of return because they are taking all the risk. Yeah. And that goes back to the point that Duncan was touching on a minute ago. So I think being clear on the role that they're wanting in these investment pipeline projects, I think is fundamental to actually making those attractive to the private sector. And we spend a lot of time in my team helping them do that. And also we obviously have the ability to lend directly to them at a very cheap rate, lower than PWLB. And again, we're not competing with the market because we've completely undercut the market, and that's deliberate. The Treasury have asked us to do that. That's the recognition of this is really tough for local authorities. Yeah. And net zero, I mean, I see it all the time. Net zero is not the issue that senior executives and local authorities worry about on a daily basis. They would love to have that as their main worry. You know, their main worry is generally getting to Friday with the critical services that they've got to deliver. So we have to help them because it's so important that incrementally we are all leaning in on the journey to net zero, and we are all leaning in on developing and driving growth. But we've all got a different part to play in that. And I think as an organisation, the National Wealth Fund clearly has some mechanisms by which we can lean in a bit more than perhaps other more market-led organisations.
And Lorna, you talked a little bit about, for example, the question on role. Sort of, what's the most common weakness or error or mistake, let's call it that places make when they come to talk to you? And maybe I'll ask Duncan a similar sort of similar. What is the most, like, if you were doing a 5 don't do's, what would be number 1? Don't do this when we first meet you, or whatever it is. What would you say?
So I think that's a good question, and I'm not sure I've got a one-hit answer to that. I think it will depend on the sector that they're in. Yeah. And wanting investment in. I think largely what we see is that the golden thread of the project or the deal or investment often gets lost along the way. Yeah. So some projects can take more than 10 or 15 years to even, they've been talked about a lot, but nothing's ever happened. That's not ideal for the private sector because they'll have all heard of these projects, but they've never seen anything and nothing's ever happened. Yeah. I think where we encourage certainly local authorities to be much clearer and tight on is, what is the strategic objective of that project? Is it a priority for your organisation? Is it a priority for the region? And that would be the same for private sector projects as well, for my colleagues in the private side of the organisation.
Yeah.
They really need to have their story straight, and often they don't. Do they have the resources to actually deliver it? You know, is it sustainable? And from I guess, again, from a financing perspective, if we are providing finance, are they actually able to pay it back? Because we are not giving grants. And interestingly, one of the asks of government with the National Wealth Fund that we didn't have before is that we're very much in the government tank on the discussions around grants and the level of grants that should be given, because I think we all recognise there is always going to be a place for a percentage of grants to be given to get projects off the starting block. However, has government got the proportion and balance right? Should more capital be deployed that can make a return relative to a grant that 1 in 3 projects never happen and the money's been spent and the money's gone? And I think one of the rules that we have in the National Wealth Fund is to make sure that what little money the government does have is working harder for literally the whole of the UK. Yeah,
no, that's a great point. Duncan, I mean, I appreciate you're investing in firms, in individual firms. So, there's a question about what the entrepreneur or potential entrepreneur, the mistake. But when you think about the place element, what's the common mistake? I can imagine places already now are knocking on your door saying, you should be doing more deals in my part of the, my part of the world, or my city versus that city. What is it that what's the error or the misunderstanding or the mistake that they're making as to why, that they don't see the results or the outcomes that they ideally would want?
So to directly pick up on that, we have just inked our first additional partnership with University of Liverpool.
Right.
And why Liverpool? Because it goes to the heart of your question here. I think Liverpool City region is actually a very dynamic place. I think for lots of sort of historical reasons, it's sort of slightly kept its light under a bushel. It's one of the places that I hadn't been to Liverpool for a long time. When I first went there about 4 years ago as part of Northern Gritstone, I was pretty blown away by just really how far Liverpool had travelled in the time. When it tells you how long it goes, I used to be a Nottingham Forest season ticket holder in the good days of Forest, which I now have come back.
Indeed,
they have. And I went to Anfield. This must have been about 95, 98. It was probably the last time I'd had a proper trip to Liverpool where I'd actually walked around and done that. And done it there. The Forest drew on that day. I'd just like to point that out. And so we've just brought Liverpool. Now, why does Liverpool work for us? It works because it's close. So things like the Northern Rail announcement last week is properly exciting for us.
Yeah.
If we can get that connectivity stronger, it allows you to create the concept of a cluster and density. Now, George Freeman has done one of George's great upbeat LinkedIn postings today about the concept of clustering, and clustering is definitely right. But you can't have a village is not a cluster. A small town is not a cluster. So what is a cluster? And a cluster is something which has sufficient density to drive sufficient activity to support somebody like us being there, who can then bring in all the other bits of the toolkit to make it happen. So Liverpool is close enough for us to our office in Manchester and our other offices to be able to service there, and we can have people going into Liverpool on a regular basis.
Yeah.
The other place within our sort of space that has the quality of research in the university and the quantum research is Newcastle. But Newcastle is a whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
Because I have to go and set up a whole new office there. And on a single site basis, it's questionable whether there's the density to make it work. And that's the hardest thing to explain sometimes. And this was the point made at the select committee a couple of weeks ago with the MP for Plymouth. Yes. There are great things happening in Plymouth, but just not enough of them to make an ecosystem build around it.
Yeah.
And I think that is an understanding of just what you need to be successful, I think, is one of the things. And sessions like this are really helpful on that. I mean, the other thing that was painful 4 years ago was actually just the lack of ambition, because I think it had been beaten out of people over the previous 20, 25 years. I remember the first set of presentations I had for people looking for us to invest them. The teams all said to a person, "Oh, we're looking for £250,000." And I said, why £250,000? They said, "Well, that's all we can get." I said, "We might as well stop now. I mean, what's the point in raising 250K? Somebody in the US, probably with worse science than you and a worse potential solution, has just asked for $10 million and got it, and they'll be going past you."
Yeah.
And it was that, and I think one of the things that we've really started to see a change of is that ambition, the concept that to be a successful venture cap business, you need to be going toe to toe with things happening in the US, potentially in Israel, in terms of that ambition level and where you can take your business. And that is talking, the mythical unicorns or something, but you're talking about businesses worth hundreds of millions of pounds within quite short periods of time, and what you need to do to get there.
Yeah.
And I think just that sort of risk appetite and ambition and aspiration is really key to fuel this. And the fact is, you're going to lose money on the way as well.
Yeah.
But the winners more than compensate for the failures.
Yeah.
But you've got to have the winners, and to have the winners, you've got to have that oomph, that drive, that ambition, that desire to keep augmenting and challenging and doing things. And I think I've definitely seen a change on that in the last 4 years, because people don't ask for 250K now; they ask for 5 million, which is what we'd like them to ask for on that first funding round. But we've got quite a way to go on that, and we need some successes.
Lorna, I looked like you wanted to come in on that point particularly about the ambition question. I suppose there's and then we'll finish on just a couple of thoughts from either of you as to what will make a material difference now as we think over the next 5 or 10 years. As Duncan said, MIT and Kendall Square is 50 years in the in the making. So what do we see as being the material things that can really make a difference over the next period? But Lorna, just your thoughts on.
So I think the absolutely the ambition point is key, and I think working with the 4 strategic pilots that we've now got, I mean, I think it's quite clear that you can see that Manchester and West Yorkshire and West Midlands and Glasgow City region have real ambition, and they've actually spent some time to work out what does that look like. And we will do a lot more work with them to break down within their pipelines what we can help and what other investors can help them with. But I think they need to have a strategy and a plan to start with. And we have numerous conversations with combined authorities right across the UK, where they will say they have a pipeline and they'd really like to have a discussion with us. And we get a 1-page A4 with about 8 bullet points on it. And it's what they think the projects should be in their region. And I think the MHCLG from England's terms, doing the local growth plans will help, because we need to connect this all up with regards to how do each of these investments fit within the jigsaw regionally or locally. And I don't think to date that has happened. And I think the more the stars align with regards to the government's priorities and the region's priorities, there's going to be some real winners there for sure.
So are you confident, Lorna, that, or you, in the sense that looking forward to, obviously you've got your strategic priorities already, but industrial strategy from your perspective, which white paper imminent, etc., that is probably a milestone to try and bring a bit of coherence between the national and the local from a national wealth fund perspective, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think probably, as you would accept, probably a bit more for my private sector colleagues, so Ian Brown, who is in my role but leads the private sector side. Advanced manufacturing, it's probably not going to be a huge sector for local authorities, but I guarantee you that it will be for my banking colleagues in the private sector. So again, having a bit of a strategy and a plan is a really good place to start, because otherwise, if it's so disparate, we actually don't know if we would be looking at the projects that are likely to have the most impact, have the most additionality as well, which will be key to any financing that we provide. We are judged on the impact, whether that's for catalyzing growth or whether that's for net zero. So we need to make sure that we're backing the right ones, because actually there's plenty of smaller projects out there. Whether we would consider they are completely ready or not is another question. But they're incrementally, it's really important that we help them progress them, and that's where our advisory side comes in. But from deploying our capital to get the best results for the capital that the government have, I think we need to make sure that it's the ones with the biggest impact that we're focusing on.
Brilliant. Duncan, a few final thoughts from you. You talked a little bit about Kendall Square, MIT, 50-year, etc. Gritstone, still relatively new in its establishment and in its operations. But from your perspective, the milestones that you see now over the next period, how does that sort of ramp up and expand?
So our first milestone is delivering the profit we said we would, and from that becomes the amazing purpose and impact you can have from that. But it's very clear, if we're not a successful investor, we can't have the impact we want. Now, we have just closed out a fundraise with both existing and new investors. So that was something I didn't expect 3 years in, that we'd be able to raise more capital into the company. The fact we have, from people I always describe as should know better. So they're quality people. So the Avivas, Fulcrum, and the NLGPS has lent in with additional investment. I think it's a really strong part of our stepping stone and milestones we need to have. But the real milestones for us are having the poster children to say what we are doing is successful. So that's creating businesses that are employing hundreds to thousands of people, that have developed from the local to the regional to the national to the international. Now, we have some later stage investments. There's actually one where there's an investment from the National Wealth Fund called Pragmatic Semiconductor. Now, Pragmatic Semiconductor was a lovely story of a piece of intellectual property originally created at the University of Manchester. Then the academic moved to developing in Cambridge, and the business, all the sort of the big bit of the business is based in Durham. And Pragmatic is one of our leading technology companies in the country. It was the largest tech raise in Europe 18 months ago, raised just under 200 million of additional capital. Wow. And that should get to the billion plus numbers in the next sort of 24 months. It's a fantastic business traveling really well. Those sort of stories and us being able to show our support for them and the benefits that come from that, of encouraging other people, encouraging more capital, encouraging people to have the confidence to invest in both the infrastructure and their careers within our ecosystem. That's the really important thing, is starting to mark the card on making good investments that has that flywheel effect.
Brilliant. Fantastic. I could definitely talk to the pair of you all day, but sadly I know you've got other things on and it's 1 o'clock, so we need to finish. Huge thank you to you, Duncan, and to you, Lorna, for giving us your experiences, but also genuine practical insights. I think that will be super useful for places across the country. So a massive thank you to the both of you, and thanks everybody for being on the call. If you want to watch it back, you can do it on YouTube. But until the next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks again, Duncan.